Welcome to The Movement, the podcast where we celebrate 165 years of impact and look ahead to 165 years of empowering our community with the YMCA of Greater Kansas City. Join us as we share remarkable stories from individuals whose lives have been transformed by the Y across the Kansas City metro. From members and volunteers to community leaders and associates, their journeys inspire us to keep moving forward and making a difference. Get ready to be inspired by The Movement. 165 years of impact, 165 years ahead. Let's go. A big hello to our YMCA friends and family. Welcome to The Movement. We are continuing our celebration of our 165th year of service in the Kansas City metro by taking the movement on the road, where positive community impact is being made every day in our family centers, our program sites, and on our playing fields. Today, we are thrilled to be at the Paseo YMCA in the heart of the historic 18th and Vine District of Kansas City. In May of 1914, a crowd of over 8,000 gathered as the cornerstone of the new YMCA was laid by the former mayor and longtime YMCA president, Henry Beardsley. The Paseo Y opened to serve the African-American population in Kansas City and became a cornerstone itself for community engagement. The center was funded through the efforts of both the city's black and white communities. And during the 1920s and 30s, the Paseo Y served as the main social agency for black citizens in Kansas City. It was open 24 hours. It was the only community center fully supported and operated by black residents. The Paseo Y provided a wide range of services too, including a swimming pool, a dining hall, athletic facilities, youth programs, and meeting spaces for civic and social organizations. It became a vital resource for the densely populated Paseo district, hosting thousands of meetings annually and fostering pride and empowerment within the black community. The Paseo YMCA also holds a significant place in American sports history as the birthplace of the Negro Leagues, a pivotal institution that provided opportunities for African-American baseball players during a time of segregation. The Paseo YM's influence began to wane in the 1970s, and integration of facilities and demographic shifts started happening. By the 1970s, the Paseo YMCA was no longer economically viable and was unfortunately closed. However, its historical significance has been preserved through the renovation and restoration efforts by many. The story of the Paseo Y is a testament to the power of community and the fight for equality. It highlights the importance of spaces like the YMCA in fostering social progress and commemorates the contributions of those who built and sustain the Negro Leagues. And the building's transformation into an education and research center ensures that its rich history continues to inspire future generations. We are so blessed to have the incomparable Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, with us as our guest today. Welcome, Bob. Welcome to The Movement.
Mark, it's great to be part of the movement, man. And welcome to the former Paseo YMCA, now the Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center.
I can't think of a better Kansas City hometown story to share during Black History Month in February than the birth of the Negro Leagues here in Kansas City. So I drive down 70 and I'm coming into the city, right? And I see these big letters off to my left, and you just can't miss them. But you can visually still see the big YMCA letters from I-70 as you're entering downtown from the east. It's just remarkable to be able to see that. So tell me a little bit, Bob. Thanks for your time today. You know, your legacy precedes you. But how did you end up in Kansas City? And then maybe the eventual path to where we sit today as president and driving what's happening with the Buck O'Neill.
Yeah, it's quite the journey for me. I grew up in Crawfordville, Georgia. Crawfordville, Georgia is east of Atlanta, west of Augusta, all of 500 people. And so I left Crawfordville, Georgia in 1980 to come out to Kansas City, or the Kansas City area, really to head to Parkville, Missouri, where I had received a basketball scholarship to go to then Park College, now, of course, Park University. But initially, I was headed to Howard University in D.C.
Okay.
Mark, I was going to Howard University from the time I was probably 10, 11, 12 years old. I had a brother that lived in D.C., and I would go visit him in the summers, but I had never stepped foot on the campus, but that is where I was going to school. And my senior year in high school, I get accepted to Howard University. Now, they wanted me to walk on for basketball. Didn't have scholarship money for me, which I was prepared to do. And then in the 13th hour, I get a letter from Park College saying, hey, we got a little money for you. Why don't you come up here and play basketball? And I left Crawfordville, headed to Parkville, sight unseen.
Oh, my.
And 43 years later, I finally make it to Howard University to speak at a sports marketing conference.
Great.
But it took me 40 plus years to finally get to Howard. But that's what brought me out to the Kansas City area, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah, and a little connection again. I'll do my why. I like this history stuff with why. So actually the chapel on the campus of Park University, if you go into the chapel, if you look up in the windows, you can see the YMCA logos in the windows there. So there's even more connection for us. Just more connection. So that's great. Tell me about the connection. How, just the path, how did you end up, as president of this fabulous institution?
By happenstance. By happenstance, because I started at the museum as a volunteer. Yeah, who knew? Yeah, who knew? I certainly didn't. And I was working for the Kansas City Star right out of college. And I ultimately moved into the promotions department of the Kansas City Star, which functioned as its in-house advertising agency. Mm-hmm. And so we would do promotional campaigns for not-for-profit organizations to support their events or whatever it was that they were trying to do to help raise money. Yeah. And so the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which at that time I didn't even know existed, the Star had agreed to help promote a traveling exhibition that was going to debut here at 18th and Vine in the storefront space of the Lincoln Building. Okay. The exhibition is called Discover Greatness. It is still touring the country. This was 1993. It is still touring the country some 32 years later. And so I said, well, I better go find this museum so that I can do a little research, background work to help put the promotional campaign together. And I remember pulling up in front of the Lincoln Building and going into the building to look for this museum, which I had not heard of prior. And I'm up on the third floor of the Lincoln Building, and I'm not sure I'm in the right place. And I finally peeked my head into this little office, and the late Don Motley, who was then the executive director of the museum, and I look in and I say, well, I'm looking for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he looks up at me and he smiles. He says, son, you're standing in it. It was just this one room, had some photographs on the wall, a few boxes with some artifacts, and that was the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But Mark, little did I know that I had literally stumbled into what would become my passion. I fell in love with this museum, its mission, and I fell in love with the amazing athletes who made this history. I considered myself to be a baseball fan and quickly realized I didn't know very much about the history of this game, and certainly its history in its connection to the history of this country. And I guess you could say I became engrossed in it. I wanted to learn as much as I could, didn't want to keep it to myself. And this has kind of started me down this path. So it was an awakening for me, just as it is for most of the visitors who come to experience it. But it all started for me as a volunteer. I became the museum's first director of marketing in 1998, shortly after we moved into our current home. And then in 2011, I was named president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So it's been an incredible journey to go from a volunteer to now trying to lead what I think is one of the most meaningful cultural institutions in the world. But it has been an absolute labor of love.
Yeah, I appreciate the role of the volunteer and getting them, engaged deeper. I mean, the Y was built on volunteers, and we can't do what we do without volunteers. So it's how it starts for you, but to make it your life's passion and just the commitment, it obviously exudes everywhere you go. So I'm always excited to sit here and listen to. My hope today is to learn those stories and hear some more of those things, because here it is right here in the heart of Kansas City. So let's step into maybe just a time. Let's step back in time a little bit, and maybe I look back not too far in time, but I go back to the 2012 All-Star game that came to Kansas City, and I think for a lot of people, that was a great moment the city's on show,
Mhm.
Major League Baseball, but right there at the beginning, there is this promo done by Fox that Bob's on and all these stars and the players that made that. And for the first time, I think the nation might have had an awakening of what the heck happened here in Kansas City at the Paseo Y in 1920. And so maybe take me before we go to what happened here. What was the baseball landscape like in the late 1880s and the early 1900s before even the Negro Leagues began? Yeah. What was happening?
Well, it wasn't a new phenomena for black folks to play baseball. We've been playing baseball for quite some time. And as a matter of fact, there was evidence of us, even as enslaved people, playing baseball. And so our passion for the game has been there almost from its inception. And of course, it didn't get an organized structure until 1920. And which is part of the reason that when you walk into the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we take you back into the 19th century so that people can get a glimpse of the early participation of African Americans in this game. And so there were a lot of independent teams, and there were even instances of blacks playing on white teams, but they could never stick and stay. Those efforts would typically be short-lived, and so it was very challenging for them to play baseball in an organized capacity. But slowly but surely, these teams started to form, but they were primarily independent baseball teams, which was haphazard. Guys were jumping from team to team, and it was very difficult to keep them afloat. And then something happened, I guess you could say fortuitous, because a guy named Andrew Rube Foster, and I do believe that this was at the urgence of the black press.
Okay.
The black press is very instrumental in pushing for what ultimately would become the organized Negro Leagues. They wanted something that would be mirrored right after Major League Baseball. And Rube Foster took up the challenge because there were others who had attempted to create an organized black baseball league, but they had failed. And Rube Foster, who I believe was a masterful salesman, first and foremost, because he had to convince these other 7 independent black-owned baseball teams to give up their independency and come together and organize in order for black baseball to not only survive, but thrive. And he was able to do that. And as you well know, the greater connection to this story is that meeting took place in this very building where we're recording this interview today.
This gives me goosebumps. I think about, just the ability to pull those owners. And I'm assuming most of those owners had played or not.
They had a love for the game.
Okay.
And most of them had, stuck the toe in the water as a baseball player. Rube Foster, though, was a significant baseball player. Rube Foster, as I describe him, is the rarest of baseball figures because Rube Foster, Mark, would have gone in the National Baseball Hall of Fame as a player, as a manager, and as an executive. And you don't find many, if any, that check all 3 boxes. So he had been a great baseball player, great pitcher in the early era of black baseball. As a matter of fact, he is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball. Back then, it was called a fadeaway. And Rube perfected this pitch, so much so that the great major league manager, John McGraw, would sneak Rube into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Matheson how to throw the screwball.
Yeah.
Christy Matheson threw the pitch all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from Rube Foster. So Foster had been an outstanding player himself, but he was best known as a visionary, this tremendous leader. So he would organize the Negro Leagues here in this building. He would become president of his newly formed Negro National League. He owned, as you mentioned, the Chicago American Giants, and he managed the Chicago American Giants. And as a manager, he was so tremendously savvy to the point, Mark, that he was known to fine his ball players at the turn of the 1900s as much as $5 if you were tagged out standing up.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, you were supposed to slide. Rube would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line. And if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside that circle, oh, man, he would find them. He was adamant about the style of play that would become signature to Negro Leagues baseball. Fast, aggressive, daring. They bunt their way on. They steal second. They steal third. And, man, if you weren't too smart, they were stealing home. And so that was the boldness and brashness of Rube Foster, who stood in this very building after they had agreed to charter the Negro National League. And he stood here and said, "We are the ship, all else the sea."
Tell me about some of the other charter members. Tell me some of the other cities.
Well, most important, our Kansas City Monarchs.
Okay.
They were one of the 8 charter members of Rube's Negro National League. Of course, they were owned by J.L. Wilkinson, the only white owner of the original 8 Negro League teams. And Wilkinson owned the Kansas City Monarchs. And as the late, great Buck O'Neill would say, Wilkinson was the first white man he ever met without any prejudice. He said that J.L. Wilkinson didn't have a prejudice bone in his body. You see, initially, Rube was very reluctant to have any white ownership. He was pushing against white ownership, but he kept hearing these great things about this dude named J.L. Wilkinson. And Buck would say that when there weren't enough hotel rooms to go around, they slept in the same bed together. Now, I'm not going to say that he didn't see color, because we all see color, but he respected color. And that never prevented him from being in an environment where he was around people who didn't look like him. And I am sure he caught heat from his community because he was so close to these black players. And so Rube would ultimately relent because, again, he kept hearing these things about J.L. Wilkinson, but Wilkie also had what Rube needed, access to stadiums. So in order for his new league to survive, he needed stadiums. And that was always the hindrance, I guess you could say, because by and large, the Negro League owners didn't have their own stadiums like the major league teams did. So you needed to get that access to stadiums. And Wilkie had that access. So Rube relented. He would bring in his charter Kansas City Monarchs. They would go on to become one of the greatest baseball teams, not in black baseball history, but in baseball history. One losing season in their almost 40-year existence in the Negro Leagues. And Mark, that was during World War II when so many of their stars had been called into service, sent more players to the major leagues than any other Negro League franchise. They were a model organization. There are those who will say that the Kansas City Monarchs were the New York Yankees of the Negro Leagues. There are others who will say that the New York Yankees were the Kansas City Monarchs of Major League Baseball. They were that good.
And where did they play in Kansas City?
22nd in Brooklyn. Primarily 22nd in Brooklyn at what would be known best by most as Old Municipal Stadium.
Right.
But it went through several iterations of names, most popularly Mulebach Field, when the Monarchs were playing there. So a lot of history was made on the corner of 22nd and Brooklyn. And while the old stadium is gone, and we have some remnants of the stadium inside the museum, some signage and some bleacher seats inside the museum. On the corner of 22nd and Brooklyn is a plaza known as Monarchs Plaza. And it highlights some of the great stars, particularly the African-American stars that played right there on that corner, not only with the Monarchs, but as well with the Kansas City A's, Kansas City Royals and Kansas City Chiefs all played there
Right.
at one point in time. And so there at least is some semblance of that history still remaining there on the corner of 22nd in Brooklyn, right up the hill from where the Negro League Baseball Museum operates.
How did Kansas City accept the Monarchs?
They loved the Kansas City Monarchs. As a matter of fact, I think you can make the claim that the Monarchs were America's team, not the Dallas Cowboys, not the Atlanta Braves when they had the Superstation back then, WTBS, but the Kansas City Monarchs were truly America's team because Wilkie had them on the road. And there was an old kind of sign that said the Kansas City Monarchs were the talk of the town all over the world. And I still get people who walk into this museum to this day that say, oh, my grandfather saw the Monarchs play in this town and this town, but here in Kansas City, they were the toast of the town. And it wasn't just the toast of the African-American community. The white community loved the Kansas City Monarchs as well. And so they were so significant in this community because you think about it. The closest place for us to see a major league game was either going to be St. Louis or Chicago.
Right. Sure.
So people saw professional baseball playing at 22nd and Brooklyn. Now you got the minor league Kansas City Blues. They were a New York Yankees farm team. They couldn't even remotely compare to the Kansas City Monarchs. So they drew a significant white population that was coming to see them as well. And so what does J.L. Wilkinson do? He pioneers night baseball.
I was going to ask you about innovations and what are those unique things that, when you're trying to sell tickets and you're trying to keep things moving and create some revenue, what were those innovations? You just mentioned one right there.
Yeah, well, the most significant of the innovations that come out of the Negro Leagues was night baseball. But the shin guards, the batting helmet, these things all come out of the Negro Leagues. The style of play, the bunt and run, hit and run. These things were created, perfected, later picked up by Major League Baseball. But by far the most significant was night baseball. Night baseball saved the Monarchs because Wilkie would pioneer night baseball in 1930. The history book says that the first professional night baseball game was 1935. Crossley Field, Cincinnati, Ohio, the Cincinnati Reds versus the Philadelphia Phillies. Well, the history book is wrong. The first professional night baseball game, 1930, and it featured our very own Kansas City Monarchs. Wilkie literally mortgaged everything he had to pioneer night baseball. Portable, generated light towers. So not only could they play a night game here in Kansas City, they could load them up on the truck and play a night game virtually anywhere. And truth of the matter is, Wilkie wasn't doing this to be innovative. He was doing it for survival. You see, back then, the Negro Leagues were primarily relegated to playing on Sundays. Major League Baseball really didn't play on Sundays. So the Negro Leagues would typically rent their ballpark and play that Sunday doubleheader. Well, black folks left church, going straight to the ballpark, dressed to the nines, as they would say, looking good. And so he was looking for a way to get the working class fan into the ballpark. Night baseball became the answer. Night baseball became bigger than Sunday games. And as I tell my guests at the museum, Sunday games were so popular that black churches would move their service time up an hour.
That's like moving heaven and earth, literally.
Absolutely. I tell you, because if you know anything about the black church, you don't mess with service time. 11 o'clock Sunday go to meeting. When the Monarchs were at home, service started at 10 o'clock, and then everybody filed out going to that Sunday doubleheader. But night baseball was even bigger than that. But as I tell my school-age kids when they come to the museum, here's where the fallacy occurs. American historians never viewed Negro Leagues baseball as having been professional. Thus, the major leagues got credited with something that had happened 5 years prior.
Right.
It is absolutely akin to Columbus discovering a country that already had people there. You can't do it.
Who are some of those key players that wore the Monarch jersey and cap?
Ooh.
Give me some significance. I know and I'm going to ask. I have some follow-up questions to that, but I'm this for our our YMCA, our family.
Yeah.
Just tell us these names. I'm sure some of they'll recognize if they don't know already.
And if they don't, they should come to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to learn more about them. Bullet Rogan, for me, is where the comparison to Shohei Ohtani, not Babe Ruth, because unlike Ruth, Rogan pitched his entire career. Perennial 20-game winning stuff, but when he wasn't pitching, he played the outfield and hit cleanup for the Kansas City Monarchs. Now, you don't just hit cleanup for the Kansas City Monarchs. You got to be able to rake if you're going to hit cleanup for the Monarchs. And in the beautiful vernacular of the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige, who would say of Rogan that he was the onlyest ball player he ever saw, he ever heard of, that pitched and hit cleanup. And unlike Shohei Ohtani, who is such an imposing athlete, he's a big man, 6'3", 6'4", 200-plus pounds. Bullet Rogan was on the other end of the spectrum. 5'7", 5'8". Satchel would call him a chunky fella. But he was a great athlete, led the Negro Leagues in stolen bases when he was 38 years old, and could get that ball up there in a hurry because his nickname was Bullet, but he pitched with a no wind-up delivery. And that ball just seemed to shoot out of his hands. So he was one of the early stars of the Monarchs, the great Jose Mendez. His nickname, El Negro Diamante, the Black Diamond. Yeah. And Mendez is also in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He hailed from Cuba. Yeah, he hailed from Cuba, and he was a star pitcher in Cuba, became a star here with the Monarchs, managed the Kansas City Monarchs, and was a part of the championship team that won the World Series in 1924, the very first Negro League World Series. Then you had guys like Willard Brown. Willard Brown, not a household name, even though he's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, was a tremendous outfielder for the Monarchs who, when he goes to Puerto Rico, his nickname was Ese Hombre, that man. They love Willard Brown in Puerto Rico. Yeah, Willard Brown won the Triple Crown in Puerto Rico twice. His Puerto Rican Winter League home run record, he hit 27 in 60 games, still stands to this day. And for the older Puerto Rican baseball fan, he was just as beloved as their native son, Roberto Clemente. And then, of course, you got the likes of Hilton Smith, the great pitcher who is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and, of course, the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige, who spent most of his career here. Now, Satchel played for a lot of teams, but as you know, he lived and died here in Kansas City and was better known for his time with the Kansas City Monarchs. He is, in my estimation, and I don't even think it's close, the greatest pitcher of all time. Yeah. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our other Hall of Famer, the great Buck O'Neil, who was a star first baseman for the Kansas City Monarchs, a great defensive first baseman for the Monarchs. He joined the Monarchs in 1938. He was traded over from Memphis, the Memphis Red Sox, and they brought him over to Kansas City, and it started a love affair with Buck in Kansas City. Buck loved Kansas City, and Kansas City loved him back. Yeah, but he became a great star here and finally got into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 2022, 16 years after he missed by one vote. And, of course, he passed away that year in 2006.
Fascinating. What was life like for the players, the Monarchs in Kansas City and in the 20s and 30s? Was there a connection with the Y that you're aware of? Was there a connection with what their off seasons were like? What was life like for a
lot
player?
of them trained in the Y. Joe Louis trained here at the Paseo YMCA when he was in Kansas City. Jackie Robinson spent time in this YMCA when he was staying here in Kansas City. And of course, as you know, all the African-American Pullman porters, when they came to Kansas City, this is where they stayed. You know, there was still kind of the evidence of the old sleeping quarters that were on the upper floors of this building. So A. Philip Randolph stayed here at the Paseo YMCA. Now, the players who called Kansas City home, they had their homes here. But Kansas City, they had a love affair with this city. I'll never forget, Buck says that when he joined the Monarchs in 1938, he says, I knew I was coming to the heart of America. But when he got here to 18th and Vine, he said, I never knew I was coming to the center of the universe. Oh, man, the place was jumping. And they loved it here. Now, even though they were living in an isolated world, you know, the thing that I love about sitting down talking to the barbecue baron, Ollie Gates, his institutional knowledge of the city, and particularly this area, is just, I mean, no one comes close to it. And he talks about the fact that you could only live within about a 13-block radius in this city if you were black. 13 blocks. That was it. But as I remind folks, within those 13 blocks, you had everything you needed. And so much of it when it came to entertainment that others were coming in to get some of it. And so these players were stars in this community. And as Buck would say, they go into the restaurant where you go get the best service, you go get the best table. Everybody wanted to meet you. Everybody wanted to invite you to dinner. You know, so they were big stars. He tells a story, it's one of my favorite Buck O'Neil stories. The Monarchs had played here on a Saturday night here in Kansas, a Saturday afternoon here in Kansas City. And they all going to go home. They're going to get cleaned up and they're going to come back to 18th and Vine, Mark, and they're going to meet at a nightclub called the Subway. Well, it was called the Subway because the club was actually beneath street level. And so Buck says they all get to the club sitting around the tables, sipping on a little tea. When a kid walks in, got a horn over his shoulder, he wants to blow. Everybody says, let him blow. Well, Buck said the kid gets up on stage, he starts making some noises out of this horn that they'd never heard before, but you had to pay attention. That kid was 17-year-old Charlie Yardbird Parker. And so you have to remember that from an entertainment standpoint, 18th and Vine was second to none. A jazz musician could get a gig in Kansas City when they couldn't get a gig anywhere else. Yeah. And so those guys could go play the Mule Bach, but they couldn't stay at the Mule Bach. And they all made their way back to 18th and Vine. And as you know, the Mutual Musicians Foundation is just around the corner from where we are now. And as the clubs would close downtown, they would all find themselves back there at the Mutual Musicians Foundation, and they would do the jam sessions into the wee hours. But those ball players were really at the center of that, and it created a close-knit community between the baseball players and the jazz stars.
And here we are today with the continual rebirth of this area, right? Trying to, how many years now has the push been in Kansas City to continue to bring back this history and make this more, and not even speaking to what's happening to our south here as the area continues to revitalize itself.
Well, you know, what instantly comes to mind to me is the memory of someone who was very close to this museum and one of the greatest philanthropists in Kansas City, the late Landon Rowland, who bought this building and donated it back to the museum so that we would have an opportunity to restore this landmark. You know, it was, people forget because they see this building in the state that it is in now. Yeah. They forget that it had become an eyesore. It had been abandoned and boarded, and sad to say, it was harboring illicit activity. Even sadder to say that there were vagrants who were living in this building. And I truly believe that it wasn't a matter of if it was going to eventually fall in, but when it was going to fall in, and how devastating would that have been to have lost this historic landmark to the ruins of time. And so oftentimes in our country, we tear these buildings down. And it might have been cheaper to tear it down than it was to restore it. But this is one of the most significant Negro League artifacts in existence. Now, I know people don't oftentimes look at the old buildings as being artifacts, but for us, this is the very building that gave birth to the story that we're now charged with preserving. And it had to be saved. And I'm very proud that we've been so diligent along this process of restoring this historic landmark, and it is breathing again. It's alive. And the future of this building is tremendously bright as we start to now set our sight toward building a new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that will essentially be attached to the historic landmark where it all began. And so now this is exciting, and you can feel the energy in the district. Yeah, no, I am really excited about this. I'm as excited as you can be about having to raise about $30 million.
Get that plug in now. I know that feeling.
You know the feeling.
I know that feeling.
Yeah, now you know. We share our same pain.
Yeah, but just even to where it came after, the mid 20-teens and
Yes.
bringing it along, and then obviously the pause when so it was vandalized and bringing it back alive. And
Oh man,
I mean, I think when you step in here, you can feel it. And I'm a 25-year YMCA professional, right? And I can feel it. I can feel how this community surrounded this building. My intro, we talked about all the community connection and
yes,
just the meetings and the social act, just everything that happened.
and I think back to Buck's longtime friend, again, Ollie Gates, who really championed this effort. And here is Mark is one of the most successful businessmen in Kansas City, moving even beyond the barbecue. The barbecue is just one phase of his empire. And here he was in the initial phase of this building when we were going through the demolition, in his overalls with a wheelbarrow and his boots, moving debris in this building. And then other members of the community also came in and started to assist in that effort. And when we talk about community engagement, involvement, and spirit, this building is a testament to how proud the community was to see something happen with this building. Because again, it was the only eyesore really on the Paseo. And it's amazing to see the transformation. But it's important that people remember what it used to look like before we started down this pathway. But if I had to point my finger toward anyone who helped really shape this effort, it would be my friend, Mr. Ollie Gates.
So back into the baseball conversation. So it's 1935, 1940. World War II's upon us.
Yes.
Tell me about how the Negro Leagues and the integration and things start to change, and maybe not the demise of it, but what's next? What happened?
Well, I guess, Mark, if you were going to point to any single event that led to integration, it would have been World War II. Because you had the irony of young black soldiers dying, fighting the exact same racism in another country that we were being asked to accept here in the States. And that created a groundswell of those who shared the same sentiment. Well, if they can die fighting for their country, why can't they play baseball in this country? And that gave Branch Rickey, pun intended, the ammunition to go get Jackie Roosevelt Robinson, who began his career playing for the Kansas City Monarchs. And so integration was imminent. Now, the major league owners were still pushing as hard as they possibly could against this. But there had just become this tremendous groundswell of support for integration. We were able to acquire a letter that was written by New York Yankees managing partner Larry MacPhail. And this letter is from 1945, and Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, same person that the airport is named for. He and others were leading this effort, pushing for integration of baseball. They were putting a lot of pressure on Major League Baseball to open its doors to these black and brown players of the Negro Leagues. And so he puts together a commission. MacPhail is part of that commission. MacPhail authors what is now known as the MacPhail Memorandum. We went out and bought this letter some years ago. We paid a pretty penny for this letter, probably still paying for it, but we had to have it. And in the letter, the letter is so complex. And I do a podcast called Black Diamonds that I do with my friends over at Sirius XM Radio. And for one of the episodes, I had my dear friend Curtis Granderson actually read the letter as part of the podcast, the show. And Curtis was blown away. He was absolutely blown away because in the letter, MacPhail actually outlines some points of validity, because he would go on to say things like, well, if we sign players from the Negro Leagues, we will put the Negro Leagues out of business. Well, that was going to be a natural byproduct of integration. He would also go on to say, well, these players are under contract. We cannot go in and just take them away from their Negro League teams because they are bound legally to those teams. Again, theoretically, he was right. Now, Branch Rickey didn't think so because contrary to popular belief, he didn't sign Jackie Robinson. He took Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. That's a whole nother story. But then he would go on to say something completely asinine. He would say, they lack the faculties to play in our league. Now, I don't know when you had to be a Rhodes Scholar to play baseball, but there was this prevailing belief that we weren't smart enough to play Major League Baseball. But here's the thing. Over 40% of the athletes who played in the Negro Leagues had some level of college education. Less than 5% of those who played in the major leagues at the same time had any college education, for the simple reason, Mark, that the majors didn't want you to go to college. They got you right out of high school, put you into their farm system, and then you work your way to the big leagues. Well, the Negro Leagues didn't have that kind of sophisticated farm system, so what did they do? They trained on the campuses of historically black colleges and universities. They would compete against the black college baseball teams and then recruit a great deal of their workforce from those HBCUs. Our very own Buck O'Neill went to Edward Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida. Monty Irvin went to Lincoln University in Pittsburgh, the other Lincoln University, both are HBCUs. Larry Doby went to college. So many of those players went to college. So no, that held no validity whatsoever. But then he finally gets to the crux of the matter. By the time that letter was written in 1945, the New York Yankees had netted nearly $100,000 off the Negro Leagues. They were renting Yankee Stadium. They were renting Rupert Stadium across the river in Newark, and they were renting Blues Stadium here in Kansas City, or Mulebach Stadium and later Municipal Stadium. Yeah, they didn't want to lose that source of revenue. They didn't have to work to get that. All you had to do was sign on the dotted line. And as I tell my guests, anytime they say it ain't about the money, it's always about the money. So integration was imminent. Yeah, it was imminent. And Branch Rickey outsmarted the other owners to maneuver to get Jackie Robinson in. But here's what we know. Once Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier, there's no turning back. And he has success. He has success when he breaks the color barrier. So there's no turning back. And then slowly but surely, the talent from the Negro Leagues were being siphoned out of the Negro Leagues and going into Major League Baseball but no replenishing system for the Negro Leagues, because now if you are a young, aspiring black ball player, you didn't need Negro Leagues anymore. You could go right into the major leagues, minor league, or into their major league, right directly into the major leagues. So the Negro Leagues would ultimately fold, ceased operations. By 1960, it was officially done. Yes.
So in the late 1990s, I met Buck O'Neill. I was coaching at Joe College. And it happened to be an interesting conversation because Maya Angelou was speaking at had to have been graduation. They were using my office in the babysitter. So that's kind of a staging place. So talking about larger than life figures around me. So tell me a little bit about Buck O'Neill, and then lead into that the inspiration for the education and research center. And what's that all about? What in that $30 million you got to raise?
Yeah.
What's coming? How's that going to continue to inspire this community and the world, as you mentioned, about what's happened here?
Well, I've oftentimes said, and I believe wholeheartedly this to be true in my heart and in my mind, I wish every child in America could meet Buck O'Neill. Yeah, because he was one of the most amazing human beings to ever walk the face of this earth, who just happened to be a great baseball player. But it was his humanity, it was his spirit that I think touched virtually everyone that he came across. Even if you didn't know who he was, you wanted to know him. And he wanted to know who you was. Yeah, no, I never met anyone, and I'm there for the ride. I am there for the ride. So I am witnessing this every place we went. And people oftentimes ask me what I remember most about Buck, and I was blessed, man. I got to hang out with him for quite some time. We traveled all over the country together. There were car rides, there were plane rides. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We played golf together. He was a really good golfer, and I enjoyed those moments, and I am better. I'm blessed to have had those experiences. But the thing that I remember most about Buck is that you always felt better leaving Buck than you did when you came to see him. And there ain't many that touch you in that way. He had, I would describe it as a certain innateness that was very similar to that of a Gandhi, a Mother Teresa, a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where he had the ability to see the good in everyone. Sometimes even when they weren't good, Buck saw the good in them, and it just exuded, and it spilled over on everybody. We would be places, and he would just simply go up and introduce himself. Hi, my name is Buck O'Neill. What's yours? And then they would start to engage in a conversation. And then as we were going to go on our flights, they were sharing an embrace as if they'd known each other all their lives. You know, I wholeheartedly believe that we're all here for a reason. We have a purpose. And sometimes we don't identify with what that purpose is. Other times we run from that purpose. Buck O'Neill embraced his purpose. And he lived it out so beautifully and vividly so others could see that it was indeed easier to love than it was to hate. And I think that's what we all admired about Buck. We fell in love with Buck, Mark. We never saw him play. No, we fell in love with the Buck O'Neill who told us about the heroes of the Negro Leagues. And we fell in love with the Buck O'Neill who, again, exuded this love in such a vibrant way. That's who we fell in love with. And his spirit is still here. When you walk into his museum, you feel that spirit. And that's what I want. You know, so while our children may not be able to be embraced and physically touch him, but they can be moved by his spirit. And certainly as long as I have anything to say in the matter, Buck's presence will always be felt at this museum and now inside of his Education and Research Center, because education was always at the forefront of his existence. You have to remember, This was a man who was the grandson of enslaved people, who was denied an opportunity to attend his native Sarasota high school when he was a kid, who not only understood but embraced the importance of education. He would say things, and it would always amaze me because I consider him to be a Renaissance man. He was always in touch with whatever what was going on. And he'd say stuff like LL Cool J would say that an education is like a garden growing in your mind. And in order for that garden to grow, you got to water it. And that's the outlook and the positive way that he viewed this. So he was always humbled by the fact that we were going to build an education and research center in his memory, because education was always so important for him. And he would talk about how the Pullman porters may not have been educated, but they saved their money so that their children could be educated. And that meant the world to him.
So what's Buck think today?
Oh,
he was here. What he stopped the fuss?
And I do believe that he's looking down. He's smiling. Yeah, he would be extraordinarily proud of his museum, the fact that folks have continued to support his museum, and that he's being remembered in such a beautiful way. You know, we just opened the Buck O'Neill Bridge. And when the governor and all the dignitaries were there for the ribbon cutting of the bridge, and I said this and I meant it sincerely, if anyone deserved a bridge, it would be Buck O'Neill, because he so beautifully bridged black and white, young and old, men and women, like unlike anyone I've ever seen in my life. And so there's a Buck O'Neill Bridge. There's his Negro Leagues Museum, a Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center. These things keep him alive. Yeah, keep him alive. And I remember at his memorial service, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver gave eulogies along with Ken Burns, Ernie Banks, Lou Brock. It was a beautiful service. And Congressman Cleaver said, as part of his eulogy, and this has stuck with me since that his untimely passing, he says, as long as we remember Buck, he'll never die. Yeah.
I appreciate the most about the restoration and the continued purposing this hallowed ground, and I will just say that.
Yeah.
It really does fit right into the entire mission of the Y, of being inclusive, about education, about youth, about continuing to move this community forward. Not only this community, but how the Y impacts the greater country and the world as a whole. So the legacy that's being continued to move forward here is inspiring. And so what's the lasting legacy of the Negro Leagues?
I oftentimes say, particularly as it relates to my student groups that come to the museum, and I share this with their parents when they're with them, I love seeing the families come intact to absorb and learn this history, and I think be inspired by this history. Number one, it is such an amazing chapter of baseball and American history that most of us were not privy to during our own formal education. You had no way to learn. It wasn't that you didn't want to learn. And I've oftentimes said, I don't think there was ever a time people didn't want to know about the Negro Leagues. They just had no way.
There was a resource for it, right?
Leagues. Exactly. Or as my late mother would say, you don't know what you don't know. Right. And so for me, if our children, when they come and they walk through that museum, if they walk away knowing nothing other than this, what the Negro Leagues teaches us is very simple. You see, in this great country of ours, if you dare to dream and you believe in yourself, you can do or be anything you want to be. You see, Mark, they dared to dream of playing baseball. They had no idea they were making history. They didn't care about making history. They just wanted to play ball. But as I remind my guests, the pride, the passion, the perseverance, the determination, the courage that they demonstrated in the face of adversity. Our story is not about the adversity, but rather what they did to overcome that adversity. And our children need to be touched by those kinds of stories. And that's what this museum represents. That is essentially what the Negro Leagues represented. Because for me, you walk through there, man, you're going to meet some of the greatest athletes who ever played this game. We almost de-emphasize the players in lieu of the story.
I just wrote down. It's more than baseball. It's not baseball.
It's not. Baseball is just a premise for a far more grandiose story.
And the impact. Well, we love being a part of the story as the YMCA, and again, nobody tells a story better than you. I'll put you up against anybody. So thank you for that. What happens next with the museum? Where are you at on the fundraising? Seriously, what's kind of the timeline?
We're out there pounding the pavement, trying to raise some money for this project. Now, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum never does anything typical to these kinds of processes. We just went out and told everybody that we're going to raise $30 million. So I guess we ain't got no choice but to go raise this $30 million since we've told them now. But now we're excited about this, and we're in the capital campaign phase of this project. We had given ourselves 5 years to raise the money. I would like to raise it sooner than that. This project has morphed into something even larger than what we had initially announced when we announced it back in May of 2023, because now we are partnering with Grayson Capital, and they are going to build a hotel that essentially will be built right into the new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. That's exciting. And so we're seeing this kind of renewed spirit here in the district. And so, yeah, we'll get this thing done. I hope we can get it done sooner than later. In a perfect world, we'd have it ready in 2026. That's a little ambitious and take advantage of the World Cup being here. But it would still be pretty cool that once the World Cup comes and goes, maybe the very next year, a new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum opens up and we can continue to build on that great momentum that we're seeing in our city. I'm excited to see the eyes of the country squarely focused on Kansas City. Yeah, Kansas City is the envy of a lot of cities. Yeah, we kind of got it going on right now in KC, and we want to keep that momentum. And we're thrilled to be a part of that momentum that is Kansas City.
You've got the support of the Y. We're here, and however we can be supportive as a great partner, and whether it's bringing our youth development kids over here or the summer camps that we have. The story is such a great story, and
yes,
just love how you guys tell it here. So. I always end my podcast with a final four. So these are just easy questions for you to answer. So hopefully it won't be too tough. So the first one I got for you. So mustard, ketchup, or relish on the ballpark hot dog?
Ketchup and mustard.
Okay, it's a combo. Yeah.
Which, is so interesting because, we do the Heart of America Hot Dog Festival. And I know in the eyes of a lot of people that is sacrilegious. But I'm a ketchup and mustard guy on my hot dog.
It almost makes a barbecue. So, Bob, I probably know the answer, but I want to know what you think your superpower is.
That's, you don't never really think about it when you're in the midst of it. But somehow or another, I've earned this reputation as being a great storyteller, but I hope too that, and I do feel like some of the things that exuded from Buck spilled over on me, because I love people too, and I love meeting people. I get down in the exhibit on a whim, and I just run down. I won't even tell people who I am. I'll just start running my mouth and walking them through the museum. I saw Buck do that for years, and I'm saying to myself, if Buck O'Neil can do that, well, Bob, you get down there and you meet these people who are coming to see and experience this museum, because number one, you never know where your next donor is coming from, but it also, I think, when they walk away, and sometimes at the end of me taking them through the museum, I'll then tell them who I am. And I think in some ways it enhances their experience. But somewhere along, I've gotten tabbed as being this storyteller. And as a matter of fact, God created a T-shirt that we sell in the museum that labeled me as the Chief Storytelling Officer, the CSO.
I love it. I love it. Sitting here listening to you. Last question. Yeah, I talked about all these great historic figures. If you were to pick the one that inspires you the most, who?
Oh, so without question, Buck. Yeah. He was my mentor, my confidant, and one of my very best friends. And outside of my mother, father, and my middle brother, I'm the baby of 6. And some reason or another, my middle brother, Fred, and I connected on a level. He just took a liking to me, and he has been such a tremendous inspiration to me. But outside of my family structure, no one has influenced me more than Buck O'Neil. And and so I think back and I reflect, man, they paid me to hang out with Buck O'Neil. Something that I would have absolutely done for nothing. And what a blessing it was for me. And I say this, and I say it in all earnest. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't think about Buck. And I talk to Buck almost every day. Now, he doesn't always talk back to me, but I talk to him almost every day, and I do feel like he is guiding my footsteps. There would be those who would be intimidated to try and walk in his shoes because you can't feel them. And they would maybe fold by the weight of his shadow looming over them. But I don't see that. It's an honor to walk in his shoes. And for me, his shadow protects me. And I do believe that he's guiding my footsteps. As I tell people all the time, there's an old adage that says, the good Lord takes care of babies and fools. And I'm not sure which category I fall in, but Buck is there. He's in my heart. He's in my mind. He's in that museum. And I hope it's that way forever.
Spirit's here too.
There's no question about it.
And that my YMCA family is Bob Kendrick, master storyteller, self-prescribed, Kansas City community gem, all the way from Crawfordsville, Georgia, to Kansas City. I love it. I love it. Thanks so much for being on the movement today, Bob.
Oh, man, Mark, thanks so much for having me on the show. It was an
Just
honor.
A reminder that the Y is a place where goals are achieved, friendships are built, and lives are truly changed. So stay motivated, stay connected, and keep moving forward with us in the movement. Whew, together, we are building a stronger community one story at a time. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for spending time with us on the movement. Visit kansascitymca.org for more information and follow the YMCA of Greater Kansas City on social media. 165 years of impact, 165 years ahead. Let's go.